hospitality. I was really excited and blessed last week when I was able to speak because of the fact I felt so welcomed. And I felt as if what I was speaking and what I was teaching was falling on attentive ears. I speak a lot, different conferences and student environments. A lot of times, I see people fall asleep, and that's okay, but I saw everyone here was really attentive, and that excites me because I know that we're looking to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, we come to church every Sunday, praise God. We read our Bibles as often as possible, praise God. We pray unto the Lord, praise God. But sometimes we're comfortable with that, and I think a lot of times God wants us to press in even more. What more? How much more closer can you get to me? I mean, especially again, when I bring up that verse where he says we're to love him with all of our heart, soul, strength, and our mind. And sometimes we might get one of those out of the four, maybe two, maybe three, but we can work on all of those. It all praises and glorifies God, and that's what we're to be. We're to be living sacrifices. I'm going to give up some of my own time, some of my own entertainment, some of my own, and honestly, for me at least, my own time and my own entertainment and my own desires always point back to the scriptures now. Before it used to be on something else, and there's other things you can fill that time with. But for me, it's a joy. I think of the verses in some of the Psalms. I mean, it's not a chore. It's not something that's hard for me to do, to be able to honor and to love your word and to love your laws. And that's hopefully what we're getting to today as a community of believers here to be able to do that. So, amen. Thank you again. I am so blessed and feel so honored to be able to speak here. Thanks to Pastor Adams and for Sister Adams for that great welcome. It is just my joy and my heart to be able to serve in any way possible. If Pastor Adams would have called me up and said, we need help setting up tables, I would have ran and got some tables. We need someone to bring us pizza and chili dogs. I don't know. Again, I work with youth groups a lot, so that's what I'm used to doing. I will do that because it's my joy. If I know there's going to be a group of people here ready to hear and to learn from what God has spoken, what God has revealed, I want to be there and I want to serve. This is I believe, my gifting because it's a gifting, it's a calling from God. When you tell somebody what you want to do, and they tell you you're crazy, or they tell you, what are you trying, and they even try to talk you out of it, all right? And you can't shake it. It just won't go away. I mean, sometimes it might be what we call a fad or a time of excitement, and then it fades away, and we realize it was just something we were going through. But this thing I could not shake. I started it, I started studying, I started getting into the scriptures, and I just couldn't shake it. I had to learn more, And the more I learned, the more I wanted to teach. And the more I started teaching, the more I wanted to learn. And all back and forth. All through this, all I wanted to do was glorify God. I wanted people to know who God was, who they were in relationship with God. Simple, immediate. And the fact that God provided that way. And that God was like no other God or no other thought or no other worldview that we could possibly look at. That it was very, very unique in its way. And God was very loving in the way only he could love. And people need to understand that. I say this all the time. People reject Christianity or reject coming to church or reject listening to a Christian because of what they perceive of Christ. Or what they perceive of a Christian or what they perceive of a church. They have not really seen the true Christianity or the true Christian or the true church. And we need to show that to them. And it's up to us to be able to train ourselves and to prepare ourselves to put ourselves on display. I wish I would have gone to your class now. Because you are not like some of the apologists that I've seen. So you can defend the scriptures and you can tell people about who God is. But you could do it in a way that actually pushes someone further away from the church or from knowing who God is. And that is not apologetics. If apologetics doesn't draw people closer, you're doing it wrong. Okay? And sometimes, some people are hard-headed and they don't want to hear it. But that's where the relationship building comes in. So not just on college campuses, but also in high school students, we do this training because one day our high school students are either going to go off and work in a job in the secular world or they're going to college. And even there, they're going to face these challenges. So we equip students to be able to know what they believe and to be able to defend what they believe by doing presentations, by speaking to each other, by learning how to ask what kind of questions, and to coming to rational conclusions. They're going to ask these questions and they say, okay, I need to think this through. Most of our students don't know how to think anymore. All they know is it answer A, B, C, or D? They don't care why. They just want to get it right so they can get on to the next class. We've lost the art of thinking, and that's really what we try to press them with Ratio Christi. If anyone's interested in more information about Ratio Christi, we're around all kind of different social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, what's the other one? Instagram, Twitter, Instagram, and our website. Also have YouTube. YouTube is under my personal name. I do put teachings on there a lot, so if you're interested in just seeing what we teach on a random basis, you can go onto YouTube, just look up my name, Gene Calderon, and I'm just kicking off this new thing throughout the week where I'm having themed days, which is just fun for me because I think like this, okay? So, in other words, if it's Sunday, I'm going to post something about science that points back to God, or that supports the scriptures. I call it Sunday Science. And then on Monday, I have Messiah Monday, where I go into the Jewish history and culture. Tuesday equals Truth Day. I show us why we believe the Gospels are true. Worship Wednesdays, how we live a life of worship. Theology Thursdays, where we focus on who God is and the nature of God. And then Philosophy Fridays, where we learn how to think and challenge ourselves with some of those. So that's kind of what I'm doing. If you're interested on YouTube, you can find me there. If not, just hang out with me sometime. We'll talk. Okay? All that to be said, like I do speak at different conferences. I'm really excited about this one conference I wanted to bring up to you. It's going to be in Dyer, Indiana on May 3rd and May 4th. Great speakers. If you enjoy what I say, you're going to enjoy these speakers a lot more because they're the ones I learn from. I happen to be speaking at this one as well, but we do have a couple of people coming in. We have Dr. Michael Icona, who's an expert in the Gospels, and is partnered with the world's expert of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, named Gary Habermas. He is a partner with him. He's done some great work. He's the keynote speaker. We also have another speaker coming in who I've had in before. He's a good friend of mine. His name is Ted Wright. He is the founder of Epic Archaeology. He's an archaeological specialist. And again, he does a lot of great work improving in archaeology why we believe what we believe. So those are just two of the speakers that are coming. I believe general admission is $25. Students is $20. If you want to go, let me know, because if you put in the code Calderon, my last name, Calderon 2019, you will get 30% off, okay? So I've set that up because I know these people, they're good friends of mine, and they're great apologists. So all that to say, this would be another great opportunity. This is the first local apologetics conference that I know about of this kind. So I would really encourage you to be able to do that, simply because you might be interested in what we're doing here. So if you're interested in this, you'll love that. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. The times on it, I don't think it's on there. Maybe it was. It's going to be, the first day is going to be Friday. I believe doors open at 6. Teaching starts at 7. It's going to be kind of from 7 to 9, 7 to 10 maybe, a little bit late. And then on Saturday, I believe it starts at about 8. It should be done by 3. Okay, so again, great information there based on truth in the world of opinions, or in the age of opinions. So again, it's very, very important that we understand the difference. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. Defendersmedia.com is where that's at. And so just wanted to make everyone aware, if you're interested in apologetics, that is something coming up that's going to be, I think, really, really good for everyone. I'm excited about it, and I'm speaking.
We would like to attend, but that's our Christian Women's Retreat.
Oh, Christian Women's, okay, I understand. Schedules go back and forth, but yeah, praise God. But if anything comes up, if anything comes up, I will let you know. I'll let you know about other things. So why Christianity? I asked somebody last week, why do we believe the Bible is true? If you don't mind me asking, I give you a chance to talk to me. And I know nobody likes talking except me, and maybe Pastor would like to talk. But can I ask, can anyone tell me why you're a Christian? Just like a simple 1 or 2 sentence kind of idea. Why am I Christian? Why are you a Christian? What reason would you give if somebody just simply asks, hey, so why are you a Christian? Yes, ma'am.
Because I believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ. I'm a follower of the teachings of Jesus Christ, and I live my life according to the way He lives.
Okay, awesome. Anybody else like to share why you're a Christian? Yes, ma'am.
I think I believe basically the same, but my devotion because of my relationship
Okay.
has grown. The more I learn of Him, the more I wanted to learn of Him,
Mm-hmm.
and then the devotion came to that.
Okay, awesome. Anybody else like to share why we're a Christian? Anybody not sure you're a Christian? reason why I say that, again, I try to bring out examples of where we're at with Christianity and get an idea of why Christianity is struggling so much. Because when I say, does everybody want to share? Everybody should be like, I'll tell you. Everyone should be that way. If you were to go to some of what we might call like the sin movements, and I mean these gatherings of people that are based on a lifestyle of sin, whatever sin that might be. Okay, there's many, there's multiple. Like, you know, tell somebody, hey, why do you do drugs? I'll tell you why I do drugs. Because why do you drink alcohol? I'll tell you why I drink alcohol. Why do you live your life this way or that way? There's plenty of different, and they can't wait to tell you. They almost brag about this. When I ask, why are you a Christian? We've been so pushed down by the world that we're afraid to share that. And it's because I think we don't know. Maybe we've grown up in that environment. Maybe that's all we've ever known. And if that's the reason, then we can't go to the person who's living or a different kind of lifestyle. Whether it be, like I said, something of the sin movements or even something of a different worldview. We can't go to them and tell them that they're wrong because they're choosing to live their lives based on the same way that I'm choosing to live my life. If I choose to live my life for Christ, simply because it feels good, that's great, okay? But it's not very deep. If I choose to follow Christ because all of my friends go to church, or I like the fellowship at church, or I even like the message, and I even like Jesus' teachings, as Sister Adams said, that's great. But you can't share that with somebody. They'll say, well, you like his teachings, I like Muhammad's teachings, I like Buddha's teachings, I like what my science teacher teaches me. I praise God. If you're in the right place, it's deeper than that. If I can confess, if somebody asks me why I'm a Christian, I would say, well, I'm a Christian because I actually believe it's true. Which now answers every other worldview and religion. Why am I not a Buddhist? I don't believe it's true. Why am I not a Muslim? I don't believe it's true. Why I'm not strictly a scientist? Well, I believe science has the answers to everything. It points us in the right direction. But why am I Christian? Because I believe it's true. What if Christianity was false? I wouldn't be a Christian. I'm trying to live an honest life, according to what we know. And again, it's that intellectual side that we really need to develop as spiritual people. I don't deny the spiritual. I come from a charismatic Pentecostal type of church. Now, we're all about the spiritual. And it's very rare. I'm one of those rare breeds where I love the intellectual, but I love the spiritual as well. So people in my own denomination look at me like, what are you doing studying that? I'm obeying God. So this is what we need to do, because our students and even us ourselves, we're going to face these kind of problems. For example, there's a scientist named Richard Rorty. As I mentioned last time, there was a man named Richard Dawkins that I mentioned, but Richard Rorty says this: we try to arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, and religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own. You see, they're on a mission. They're not afraid to tell you why they believe what they believe and why you ought to believe that too. They want your students to come to their college so that they can do this to them. So that they can first tell you that you're religious and bigoted and homophobic and all these other words that they will tell them that they are. And teach them that that's what they are. And our students, just trying to get the grade, haven't been trained to think, will fall for it. And it's been happening far too often. And so this is why, again, thank you, Pastor Adams, for allowing me to be able to do this, because I think this is so important. I see way too many students. I see way too many children of the pastors that I know falling away from the church. I mean, I have pastors, I'll keep it very, very confidential. I'm not going to tell you who, but I have had pastors call me. My son, my daughter is walking away from the faith. I don't know what to do. They grew up all the time in church. And I start to realize they didn't know why. One of the famous quotes, or favorite quotes that my teacher tells me is, why are students so easily talked out of church? It's because they've never been talked into it. They've just been told, yeah, this is what we do. This is what mommy and daddy do. This is what the family does. So this is what you do too. But they've never really been talked into it. They get talked out of it very, very easily. And so that's kind of what we're doing today, is why we're looking at why Christianity. And if you remember, I'm going to do a quick review about last week. And we talked about the four questions that we want to ask really quick are, does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament true? And the first thing we looked at was this idea of truth. And we brought up St. Augustine, who had this famous quote that he always says about truth. He says, we love the truth when it enlightens us, but we hate it when it convicts us. And I'm sorry, whether you like it or not, when something is true, it is true. When you don't like it or not, it's the opposite of that truth is going to be false. So if we believe something that is not true, it's going to be false. And so we learned about that. There is no other options when it comes to something being true. And I talked about that. How do we discover truth? Well, a really easy way is to apply a claim to itself. When somebody says something to you, you take that and you apply it back to it and see if it works. And if it works, it's true. But if it doesn't, it's false. So one of the main things I brought up is when somebody comes up to you and asks you or says to you, there is no truth. What can we ask that person about what they just said? That's right. We look at them and say, is that true, right? Because when somebody says there is no truth, then you can ask them, is that true? Because if it's true that there is no truth, then what you just said doesn't have to be true, yet you claim that it's true, right? And it defeats itself. Immediately, we can realize that what they just said is false. They first are trying to borrow from truth in order to tell you that truth doesn't exist. And by doing that, they self-defeat themselves. So since we can know truth does exist, and we can know it, we can now start to apply this on the different worldviews that exist in our world, right? And those three different worldviews were theism, the idea that God made all, right? We showed the pictures where we have the picture of the planet Earth and the hands are holding it up and sustaining it. That's theism. And then we have the hand in the world as if the hand is part of the world, and we know that to be pantheism, as if everything is going to be part of God one day, or God is just one great essence, and one day we will all merge together to be whatever that is, okay? Buddhism and Hinduism and New Age kind of stuff. Go hug the trees and the rocks, because one day we will all be this one essence kind of idea, okay? And then lastly is atheism, that there is no God. We just happen to be here either by chance or by necessity or something like that. But we went over last week 2 scientific arguments and 1 philosophical argument that help answer these questions. And that those 3 arguments were basically this: the beginning, the design, and morality, right or wrong, good or bad. Okay? And what we came to understand, or to the conclusion was that whatever it is that started everything off in the beginning has to be immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. Timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Why does it have to be all these things? Because we understand by science that time, space, and matter had a beginning. And if the creator of those time, space, and matter is time, space, and matter, it doesn't work, because nature cannot create nature. Nature already exists. You need something beyond nature in order to create nature, or something that we would call supernatural in order to create nature. Nature cannot create nature when nature already exists. It just doesn't make sense. But again, that's one of those things we fall for all the time. So whatever created everything out of nothing has to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, has to be incredibly powerful to be able to create out of nothing. And he intricately designed his creation, and therefore he must be extremely intelligent to be able to put all this information together. And we went over some of that information, like the amount of information in a single cell is beyond anything we could ever hope to maybe even write maybe one day, because it's like 1,000 volumes worth of encyclopedia information in one cell. We learned that. And also, besides being extremely intelligent, we know he has a purpose. You don't put that much information into something or direct it towards something unless you have a purpose for that. And then morally, we understand that he is the absolute, he's absolutely morally perfect, and therefore is our standard of good and bad and right from wrong. And he is personal, because when we go against his perfect standard, we sin against him. And he also decides to create. An impersonal force does not decide. So for instance, gravity is an impersonal force, right? So if I keep dropping this, do you think gravity is going to say, if he drops that one more time, I'm not going to put it down? No, it's an impersonal force. It cannot decide to do that. A personal force can decide, I want to create, and then speak, or make it happen however he decides. So time and space is immaterial, extremely powerful, extremely intelligent, purposeful, morally perfect, and personal. These are all the attributes of the God of biblical Christianity without once having to reference the Bible. The Bible's good. We can use it. But if you talk to somebody who does not believe in the Bible, you can still point them to God without opening it. Paul does this. I know several times. Jesus does this. So I don't need to open a Bible. I can show you just through natural revelation that there must be a God. So what we've done by those three arguments, when we look at these three different worldviews, is we eliminated two of them. Pantheism and atheism cannot work with the science and the philosophy that we know. The only ones that could work are possibly Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Those three are theistic religions. One of those three could be true. How are we going to know? How can we find out? Well, if the God that does exist, the kind of God that does exist that these three faiths believe in, well, then God would be able to speak or be able to communicate in such a way that only he can, and to let us know which one of these is true. Is it Judaism, Christianity, or Islam? Now, let's go back a few hundred years and pretend that I'm a king living in my castle hundreds of years ago, way back when we had kings and castles, and I wanted to get a message to the other king that lives hundreds of miles away. I'm going to write a letter, give it to my carrier. He's going to be on horseback. He needs to ride for 3 days to get to the other king. And when he gets to that other king, and that other king opens up the letter, how does that king know it came from me? How do we know that? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, a seal or a stamp or something on that letter lets him know, this came from King so-and-so, right? And immediately he would know this message could only have come from him. Why? Because it has that seal. And there's two characteristics about that seal that need to be present. First of all, it has to be hard to duplicate. Because if it's easy to duplicate, somebody could send messages in my name that are false, that are lies. So it has to be hard to duplicate. Second, it has to be immediately recognizable. That the moment they see it, they realize, that's King so-and-so's seal or stamp. And it's hard to duplicate, so I know it can't be a lie or a forgery. It has to have come from him. In what way does God communicate to us to let us know who is speaking for him that is immediately recognizable and hard to duplicate? This is what we would call miracles. Miracles. Because when we read in the scriptures, we see all this, and we see many times in the scriptures where people are trying to perform miracles, and they're trying to point people to different gods, but then the one true God does show up. And you realize, wait a minute, I think that's the true God, because that is hard to duplicate, that is immediately recognizable. And I'll give you some examples. But there were people doing that. But we live in a scientific age now. And many people have a really hard time believing in miracles, and so they start to ask, are miracles even possible? Well, let me tell you this. Of all the miracles in the Bible, which one do you think is the greatest miracle of all? And I'll give you two hints. It's not the virgin birth, and it's not the resurrection. Which is the greatest miracle of all? Would anybody like to guess? Yeah, creation itself, right? There was nothing that existed. And all of a sudden, out of his spoken word, boom, we have everything. And it's created, and it's in order. And here we are today, still living in that greatest miracle of all. Now, I will give you this. The virgin birth, we needed that. The resurrection, probably the most important miracle. But I wouldn't say it's the greatest. Because here you have someone who back to life. That's okay. Can God create life? Yeah. He breathed life in the first place. The hard part was doing it out of nothing. At least when Jesus was in the tomb, he had something to work with. So that's a step easier, I would think. I don't know. That's just my guess. But if we admit that God does exist, as we looked at scientifically and philosophically, C.S. Lewis, who is a great Christian writer and theologian, he says this: if we admit God, must we admit miracles? He says, indeed, you have no security against it. That is the bargain. If you're going to admit, which we did scientifically and philosophically, that a theistic God must exist, then we have to also admit that that theistic God can perform miracles. And we are living in the greatest miracle even still today. So why miracles? Why does God decide to use miracles in order to communicate who is for him? Well, a couple of ways I like to present it is, first of all, the miracle confirms the message. When somebody presented a new message or a new saying or a new revelation from God, they usually had to back it up with a miracle. Or another way to say it is that the sign confirms the sermon. I don't know if you've ever read the Bible from front to back, from Genesis to Revelation, but if you notice, the miracles that are written in the Bible are not spread out evenly. In fact, you have some books of the Bible that have no miracles in them at all. Why? Because miracles have a purpose. We see them in clusters around certain people, such as Moses, Elijah, and Elisha, and Jesus and his apostles. Because God needed to confirm these groups of people. Moses is out tending the flock. One day he sees a bush on fire and decides, I want to go see what that is. And he realizes that it's God. And God tells him, Moses, I want you to go back to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And Moses is like, God, I don't know if you know this about me, but they really don't like me over there. And in fact, if they see me again, they might want to just kill me. And there's no way I'm going to be able to get to the Pharaoh. And after this long argument with God, right? After this long argument, God puts Moses in his place. And Moses is like, all right, God, yeah, you're right. I can't refuse you. I will go. But how are they going to believe me? What does God tell Moses to do? Drop your rod, drop your staff. What happens? It becomes a snake. Picks it back up, turns back into a rod. Puts his hand in his coat, pulls it out, full of leprosy. Put it in, put it back out, completely healed. And then God says, if that doesn't work, you know that big river down there they call the Nile that they worship? We'll turn that to blood. That's bound to get somebody's attention to let you know you're speaking for me. Right? It works. What about Elijah? Elijah thought he was all by himself. He's up on a mountain on Mount Carmel all by himself against about 400 priests of Baal. And they set up this sacrifice to find out who is really truly speaking for God. So they have the Baal worshipers sacrifice here and Elijah all by himself over here. And Elijah is the smart one. You guys go first. Call on your God, let's see what happens, right? And they're dancing, they're chanting, even to the point they start cutting themselves and trying to arouse their God in any way they can possibly can. Nothing happens. And Elijah comes up, says one prayer, and fire comes down from heaven, and the crowd starts saying, and the Lord is God, and the Lord is God. The message confirmed by a miracle. The easy one is this. Jesus, for about 3 years, was walking around saying, I'm God. Okay, now, he doesn't say it in the English language, he says it as a Jew. Okay, but he starts showing the people and letting people know that he is God in the flesh. And one day he walks into the temple and they don't believe him and they challenge him. Who gives you the authority to do this? And Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll build it up again. They don't believe him. They have him arrested. They kill him, beat him, or they beat him, kill him, bury him, and then 3 days later he comes back and says, told you. Right? So the miracles confirm the message, the sign confirms the sermon. Now again, like I said, some people still have a hard time believing in miracles. They'll look at things such as Noah and the flood and say, well, I just don't believe that can happen. Or what about the resurrection of Jesus? Unfortunately, I know some people who have died and none of them have come back. And what about this idea about Jonah and the whale? Is that the tail of a whale or a whale of a tail? That's what they wonder. But if miracles are possible, and which we have to admit, if this God exists, and if Jesus came and said he is God in the flesh and was able to back that up by his own death and resurrection, which confirms everything that he said, and we know that God can't lie, then we can look at all these different miracles, and even the ones that we talked about, Noah and the flood and Jonah and the whale, and we can say, we believe those are true because Jesus himself said these were true. And if Jesus was able to confirm who he is, God in the flesh, Emmanuel, God with us, and God cannot lie, then we understand that those other miracles are true. So again, if God exists, we have to admit miracles. If Jesus claimed to be God in the flesh and he backed it up by the death and resurrection of himself, then we have to take his word and look at that and say, that's pretty convincing that everything is true that he says, and especially about miracles, confirming for the one who speaks for God. The one who speaks for God, for us, is Christ, which is where we get the root for being a Christian. This is why we go in this direction. Now some people say, well, what about those other two theistic religions? What about Judaism? Well, Judaism stops with Christ. They don't accept him as the Messiah. They expected more of a political ruler, and because Jesus didn't do that, they don't accept him as Messiah, and they have stopped where the New Testament starts. All of the Old Testament, what they call the Hebrew Scriptures, or what they call Tanakh, that is where they are, and they will not go beyond that. And so they're stuck there. But Christ said he was the one, and he backed it up. So Judaism is kind of ruled out. What about Islam? Well, they have a sacred text as well, right? They have what's known as the Quran. Okay, and if you read in the Quran, you find some interesting things when it's compared to Jesus and Muhammad. They love Jesus. They think Jesus is a great prophet. They hold him in high esteem. If you want to have an open conversation, you can talk to a Muslim about Jesus. They'd be happy to do that. But what does the Quran say about Muhammad? It says, and they say, why are no signs sent down upon him, talking about Muhammad, from his Lord? Muhammad is supposed to say that the signs are only with Allah, and I'm just a plain warner. I'm just here to warn people. I can't do any signs. I can't do any miracles. I can't do anything to show you that this is all confirmed by God or Allah. Can't do those. What does the Bible say about Jesus? In the book of Acts, Peter stands up and says, Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. See, the big difference here is that what happened to Muhammad, he supposedly received revelation from Gabriel in a cave. Nobody saw it. And for 3 years, Muhammad was afraid. He thought he was demon-possessed or just gone crazy. He had to be convinced by his wife and his wife's cousin that it sounds like maybe God was talking to you. And so after 3 years, they talked him into it. But there's no miracles confirming that that is actually what happened. Nobody saw it. We talk about Jesus. Peter gets up in front of a crowd and says, Jesus was accredited by signs and wonders, and you know what? You all were there and saw it too. So you cannot deny the miracles that you saw that confirmed that Jesus really was who he said he was. And again, why do we believe of the three theistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam? Why do we fall on Christianity? Because Christ himself made it known through the signs and wonders. He was confirmed by the miracles. Again, some scientists have a hard time dealing with miracles. There's a man named Richard Lewontin who said this about miracles. He was very open and very plain about why they don't accept or believe in miracles. He says, it's not that the methods and the institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What he's saying is, it's not that science disproves miracles, but we've already taken an oath that the only thing we are going to accept a priori, before we even do the research, is that miracles are impossible. We're going to already decide that miracles are impossible, now let's do some work. Instead of being open and saying, well, let's do some work and see if it points toward the fact of miracles being possible. Because if you do it from that point of view, you'll find out miracles are very possible. But the scientists here have already admitted, we're not going to allow that. Even if it points to a miracle, we're going to say it's something else. In fact, there was a great DVD called Expelled, where an interviewer starts talking to different college teachers about why they either lost their jobs at university, or why they lost tenure, or lost money, or financial support from financial places that would support their research. And it was mostly because they were pointing to the fact that all of creation and all of design needed something beyond the nature, beyond evolution, to be able to support this. And so one time they sat down with Richard Dawkins at the end of the whole documentary. And Richard Dawkins is the one who said, if you live by your delusion, it's called religion, right? If you guys remember last week. So he sits down with Richard Dawkins and he says, well, how do you explain it? If you're going to deny miracles, which the science convincingly points towards, how do you explain how everything came to be? And do you know what this biologist from Oxford University said? He was more comfortable with saying, well, maybe it was aliens. And at the end of that interview, he says, I can't believe it. Richard Dawkins believes in intelligent design. He didn't want to attribute it to God, but he was okay if the aliens did it. Why? Aliens don't bring morality on you. God will. He expects us to live according to his will. So are miracles possible? Yeah. Everything points to the fact that miracles are possible. And where do we read about the miracles confirming Jesus being God in the flesh? In the New Testament. Now the question we have to ask is the New Testament true? First question is, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? You'll hear this all the time. How can you trust in the New Testament when, it's been written by man and copied over and over again, and it's been years and years and years. There's no way they could have possibly remembered, and on the arguments go. But it's funny, if you look at any serious historian and look at the kind of literature that they would read, they don't even compare to how accurate and how reliable the New Testament is. For instance, if I was to give you a chart here of all the ancient writings that we still have, the most popular ancient writings that we still have, you'll notice the New Testament on top, the orange is how many copies we have. Close to 6,000 handwritten copies of the New Testament we have. When you look at every other ancient popular book in history, the only one that comes close is Homer's Iliad. We have about 643 copies of that, as compared to 6,000 copies of the New Testament. Which one do you think holds more weight? New Testament. And then the other thing is, look at the yellow. The yellow shows you how long it took before people started writing the information down. So, for instance, when we look at, again, Homer's Iliad, it wasn't written down until about 500 years after the events. Look at some of the other ones. They go on into the thousands, the 1400s, the 1200s. The New Testament, how long? About 25 years. And we're not supposed to say that the Bible is reliable because, it's been written years and years and years. No, it hasn't. It's actually pretty early. Well, you can't trust the copies. Well, we got copy upon copy upon copy upon copy, and they all say the same thing. When you compare that to any other ancient literature in all of history, it's almost embarrassing how much is on our side. Like, I'm sorry, bro, we got way too much. Now, some people will argue, well, you got copies of copies of copies. You don't have the original. How do you know that your copy says exactly what was said? Right? Well, that's pretty easy because, we don't have any originals. The books that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John wrote, those have deteriorated into who knows where. Okay, we don't have those anymore. But we do have copies upon copies upon copies. People started writing and copying these books so that they could spread around to the communities around them. Now, the advantage is that if I was the only one who had, let's say, John's Gospel, and I didn't give it to you or give you any copy, there's no way you could check if I was actually telling you the truth. But if everybody here had a copy of John's Gospel and I said something wrong, all of you could correct me. That's the advantage of having copies upon copies upon copies. And when we look at this, some people will say, well, don't you know that there's mistakes in the copies? Some will say there's even more mistakes than there are words in the New Testament. But they don't tell you about those supposed mistakes and what they're really looking at. So if I brought up copy 1 and it said God is something and the justifier of those in faith in Jesus, right? I don't know what that word is. There might have been a smudge. There might be a copying error. There might be a letter out of place. I don't know what that word is. Okay, well, we're stuck with that. But then I get another copy. Let's say somebody else brings in their copy. Okay, God is something else. You got a smudge on that word too, but it's a different kind of smudge, something and the justifier. And on and it goes. Well, my copy and your copy helps a little bit. We'll kind of put this together. And then we look at the next one, and it says God is something else. And then we get to copy 4. God is something else. Based on having all these copies and putting them together and studying them, can we get a pretty good idea of what that sentence probably said? Yeah, it might. It looks like it says God is just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And this is actually an exaggerated example of the kind of textual criticism that's out there. The kind of things that they bring up as mistakes or criticisms are actually easier to solve than this one. But they'll say, look, there's a mistake, look, there's a mistake, look, there's a mistake. In fact, one of them it says in one day, and Jesus entered into the synagogue. Or the other one might say, and the Lord entered into the synagogue. Or the other one says, and he entered into the synagogue. And people say, look, it's all mistakes. None of it makes sense. How can you trust that book? Do we know what that's saying? These are the kind of mistakes that people will bring up. So yeah, when we look at it and we realize the 6,000 copies that we have and can compare, we can actually look at those copies and even read our Bibles today and realize it says the same thing. So do we have an accurate copy? Yes, we do. Now we have to ask ourselves, do those copies tell us the truth? Because how do you know you don't have an accurate copy of a lie? And so that's what we're going to look at today. How do we know we have an accurate copy of the actual truth? To do this, I want to share with you what I call 6 E's. And those E's basically are just the beginnings of some categories we'll look at. And the first one is early testimony. Some people say it's too far off, we can't trust it. The other one is eyewitness testimony. That's the idea that the people who wrote this and the people who are reading this were there to see it and check if it was all true. We have embarrassing testimony, which is actually a real technique that people look at when they look at history. We have excruciating testimony, which I'll explain in a little bit. Expected testimony and extra-biblical testimony. So let's start off with early testimony. I want to give you a diagram, kind of some bookends about some great historical events that happened, and that is the day of the crucifixion and the day that the temple was destroyed. Now, scholars go back and forth on when Jesus was crucified. Some would say it was 30 AD, some would say it was 33 AD. Okay? Dealing with 3 years, that's pretty close. Everyone agrees, even liberal scholars agree that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. No one argues that. And what do we get in between these two timelines, in between these two bookmarks? Well, first of all, we know that Paul was executed under Emperor Nero from 65 to 68 AD. He was beheaded, and we know that from good historical and archaeological evidence. We also know that James, the half-brother of Jesus, was executed by the Sanhedrin, right? He was pushed off the Temple Mount. He somehow survived, and they still stoned him. He died, okay? So we know that happened between 62 and 65 AD. We know from archaeological evidence that the book of Acts was written about 62 AD. And we can keep going, but when we notice we're getting earlier and earlier, when we look at something written in 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians was written by Paul about 55 AD, which, notice, we're getting earlier and earlier. That's getting impressive. But there's, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8, there is a creed. And that creed dates back to about 3 to 5 years within the time of the crucifixion. Now, I know for us, 3 to 5 years seems like an eternity. When I talk to high schoolers and even college students, like 3 to 5 years, oh my God, right? Because they know what's happening tomorrow. They got these things all over and they tablets, and they already know what's happening tomorrow. And even 2 weeks from now, they know what's coming up and they know the news. But for them, 3 to 5 years, that was like a news flash. And like I said, the expert in the death and resurrection, Dr. Gary Habermas, who we got to meet and talk to in Lafayette last year, he says it's probably even earlier. He's thinking about like 1.5 to 2 years that this creed was written. This is very early information that Paul records for us in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, I didn't come up with this. This is not my saying. It was first given to me. I am now passing it on to you. And they traced it back to very, very early times within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion. Now, if you don't know who wrote the book of Acts, it was Luke. What did Luke write before the book of Acts? He wrote the Gospel of Luke, okay? So if this was written in 62 AD, we can go back and say, well, before that, he had to have written the Gospel of Luke. And when you read the opening chapter of Luke, he says, I've taken it upon myself, most excellent Theophilus, to interview people and to get to gather the eyewitness and put together an orderly account so that you would know about the things that you've been taught and believed. So many scholars would say that Luke, one of his resources might have been the Gospel of Mark, that Mark might have been around earlier. Okay? So we're starting to get earlier and earlier, and you can call me crazy, call me kooky, but I like to believe that Paul wrote all of his letters before he died. Right? That makes sense? So if he died somewhere between 65 and 68 AD, all of his letters have to predate that. And if you notice, this all happens before the temple was destroyed, which was in 70 AD. And this is actually most or all of the New Testament having been written before the temple was destroyed. Now, why do I bring that up? Because it wasn't just the temple, it was the entire city of Jerusalem. If you're familiar with the historian Josephus, he tells us about the destruction of Jerusalem. And throughout all the New Testament, nobody mentions it. Let's say I was writing a book about New York, downtown Manhattan, and I told you all about the people groups, the different ethnicities, and the restaurants, and the direction of the wind, and the weather, and the depths of the water around the island. I give you all this detailed information, but I never mentioned 9/11. When do you think I wrote that book? Before 9/11. Why? 9/11 was too big of an event for me to just say, oh, I forgot to put that in there. When I put in all these little details and I just completely forget to put, well, it's probably because it's still standing. And so when we're talking about the temple or Jerusalem and the letters of Paul and the Gospels and the book of Acts, he never mentioned that. Then we can have a pretty good guess that this is within the age of the eyewitnesses, that the temple is still standing. In fact, some of the writings make it seem like the temple is still there because they reference it. And so we have very early testimony as compared to other books of history to realize that this is reliable information. I ask students, again, let's say it's about 30 to 40 years. Could you write a paper, even a short paper, on the presidential election that happened 30 or 40 years ago today, without using internet and without using stuff like that? Could you write that? Why not? No? Do you know anybody who was alive 30 or 40 years ago? Do you know presidents that were running for president 30 or 40 years ago? They're still alive today. They'd be eyewitnesses, exactly. And see, this is our mentality. We start thinking we can, and yeah, I'll give you that. Our memory is shot. Right? Smartphones have made a lot of dumb people. I used to memorize phone numbers because you had to. I barely remember mine. So yeah, it'd be really, really hard. But back then, in that culture where it was an oral culture, you had to memorize things. 30 years, 40 years is not hard at all. They would have been easily able to remember the things that happened and record it for us to be able to have today. Again, I talk to students, it's impossible, there's no way. Yeah, go talk to your grandfather. He'll tell you about it. Right? It might take a while, but he'll tell you about it. So we're looking at eyewitness testimony. And let me show you this. Eyewitnesses is very important because the Bible actually gives us crosshairs. It tells us exactly when to look and where to look and who to look at. Because you are talking to an audience that was there when it all happened. And if you said something that was false, they would call you out on it. That's a lie. That's untrue. I was there. I saw it. I'm going to read a passage out of Luke, chapter 3. Tell me if it sounds like I'm making up a story. In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius was tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. I'm going to make all that up, and you're going to believe it. Does that make sense? It would be like if today I said when so-and-so was president, so-and-so was vice president, so-and-so was governor, and so-and-so was attorney general, and so-and-so was the mayor, and so-and-so was the dog catcher. Are you just going to believe that? Or would you actually say, no, I can actually look at who you're naming and see if they're actually in that office within the year 2019? That's exactly what Luke does here. He says, let me give you the year, all right? Because this is not just a make-up story. The year is AD 29, the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Luke is giving this to you. And then he names off 8 people that we can look at throughout history without opening the Bible. And tells you what they were doing, where they were at, and the offices that they held. And they were known to be there at that time doing that job. If Luke was wrong on any of this, he would have gotten in a lot of trouble for naming high officials that either weren't or were claiming somebody else instead of the real high official. So Luke is either a complete idiot for trying to give off this much information where he could be wrong, or he's being extremely accurate. Which one do we think it is? The history is supporting the fact that he is being very accurate about all this. This is not a once upon a time story. In fact, other historians have come to know this. When he said, a Roman historian named Aaron Sherwin-White, he says this: for Acts, the confirmation of the historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. In other words, people who have studied Roman history, you have so much information right there in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and you didn't even realize what you had. He's proven himself to be accurate time and time and time again. In fact, when we read about this, we know that the book of Acts has 84 confirmed historical details. That's a lot for one book. I don't know if you've ever done this kind of study, but 84 historically confirmed details, that's a lot for one book. And he has a lot more in his gospel. We know that the Gospel of John has 59 historically confirmed eyewitness details. And we know from the New Testament at least 30 people from secular sources. In other words, get rid of the Bible, and you will still find 30 people that the Bible mentions throughout history. At least, I got 31 here. But you'll find them all in history without using the Bible. People might argue about, like, people used to argue about Pontius Pilate. They didn't really believe Pontius Pilate lived within the time that he lived in the area that they did. Well, they actually found a stone with the name of Pontius Pilate being the prefect of Judea. And then some people brought up this whole idea about Caiaphas. Well, how do we know Caiaphas existed? Well, they found an ossuary. An ossuary, the Jewish people, when they died, they would put you in the tomb until your flesh deteriorated away and all that was left was bones of you. Then they would gather those bones and put them in a box, in a family box known as an ossuary. Well, they found this beautifully decorated ossuary. Look at all the decorations. That is very, very rare and could only be attributed to somebody of some very high ranking or royalty. Well, when they looked at the side of that ossuary, they actually saw that it says Joseph Caiaphas, which is the only Caiaphas known to have been in existence at that time in that area. So for people who didn't believe in Caiaphas or that the high priest was there and executed Jesus, we have his bones. And so that's confirming evidence. And even evidence for the crucifixion. When people will talk about people didn't really crucify that way, we actually have evidence. Here is a model of how crucifixion might have happened with the nail going to the foot. Here's an actual heel bone with a nail actually going through it in the way that it was described. So we do have archaeological evidence that supports what we read in the Bible. Now we'll move on to our third E, which is the embarrassing testimony. This one's kind of fun. It's always fun when somebody else gets embarrassed. I'm going to fly through these real quick. I just looked at the time. Anybody getting tired yet? Everybody ready to go? You guys all right? All right. Some in the back are like, all right. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Embarrassing testimony, okay? Embarrassing testimony. Do you realize how many times in the Bible we find embarrassing testimony about the disciples, right? The disciples, they are dim-witted. They fail to understand Jesus and what he's saying multiple times. And even that, they are found to be uncaring, right? They fall asleep on Jesus twice in his greatest time of need. And even once Jesus is crucified and died, they make no real effort to come and bury him. Who buries him? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, two members of the very Sanhedrin who had him executed. Now, Luke tells us they weren't there when this whole meeting got together, but they're members of the opposite team. I don't know if you realize the relationship between rabbi and disciple, but it's pretty much like father and son. You leave your home to follow this person as a father figure. And when you decide, I'm too scared to go, God forbid something happens to my father, and I'm too scared to bury him, and instead the enemy comes and buries him for me, that's embarrassing to me. It's exactly what we read about in the Gospels. And they're rebuked. Peter's called Satan by Jesus. Where's one of those places we read it? In the Gospel of Mark. Mark is not one of the 12 disciples. He is a disciple of Peter. He's getting his information from Peter. So while Mark is sitting there writing, and the good Lord called Peter Satan, I'll be like Peter looking over him, hey, Mark, you know that part about the good Lord calling me Satan? Got to write that down. But he does. Why? Because it's probably true. Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. If you're just making up a new religion, do you have to correct anybody or just kind of go with the flow? But they correct him. And he says he got in his face about it. They're cowards, the disciples, right? Peter denies Christ 3 times. The disciples run away. And come on, ladies. Who are the brave ones? It's the women who go down to the tomb to be able to realize what happened on the 3rd day. What were the men doing? writing these accounts? It's the men. The men themselves have to write and admit they were the ones hiding, and it was the women who actually went down there. How embarrassing is that? Their doubters, despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, they didn't believe it. Even after seeing him, some of them didn't believe it. In fact, the enemies believed it more so than they did because they actually put guards out front. That's embarrassing to them. And believe it or not, there's embarrassing details even about Jesus. Things that you don't make up about someone you want everybody to follow. The idea that he's considered out of his mind by his own family. Imagine being here on Sunday morning. Pastor Adams is up here preaching his heart out. And his family comes in and says, oh, shut it all down. Stop it right now. There's nothing to see here. He done flipped out. Everybody go home and have a good day. We know him. That would be embarrassing. I pray that never happened. But that would be embarrassing to him. How many of us would show up to church next week? Like, I don't know about that man. His family said he was crazy. That's what happened to Jesus. I mean, can you imagine? He's deserted by many of his followers. He's not even believed by his own brothers. Anybody got a little brother? Yeah? I know. I'm the baby, so I know. Jesus' own little brothers don't believe, hey, big shot, hey, big brother, big miracle worker, why don't you go down to this festival and show everybody what you've been talking about if you want to, you don't do this in secret. You got to let people know, right, big brother, miracle, let's see. And was Jesus, boy, go on with that festival. He just kicks him out. But Jesus, his own brothers didn't believe in him. We go on, he's thought to be a deceiver. He turns off the Jewish leaders to the point they want to execute him. He's called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped by the hair of a prostitute, which would have been seen like a sexual advance. Again, Pastor, I don't mean to use you, but let's say some woman walks in the church and starts hitting on the pastor, and he does nothing to stop her. That's like, whoa. Some woman walks up behind Jesus and just starts touching him with her hair, starts hugging and crying on him and things like that, and they're like, what is going on? But again, Jesus tells them what's going on. It's not like that, you guys. Okay? Lastly, he's crucified despite the fact that anyone who's hung from a tree is considered to be under God's curse. Okay? Anyone, in the book of Deuteronomy, anyone who is hung from God's tree is considered to be under God's curse. If you're going to start a new religion, you don't take the poster boy and put him on a tree where everyone's going to look at him and say, I'm not following him, he's under God's curse. That's what they did. In fact, I think the Jewish people did that on purpose. The Jewish people says, oh, we can't kill anybody. They stoned people anytime they wanted to. Now, they didn't do it often, but that if they wanted to execute somebody, they would stone them. They don't want to stone them. What do they want to do? And why do they want to crucify them? They want to put them on that tree so that nobody else will follow them. So again, that's the embarrassing testimony that Jesus was actually, he was under the curse. He was ours. He took it upon himself. And this is where we get the word excruciating. The excruciating testimony. Does anybody know what excruciating means? Doesn't mean to hurt really, really bad. It doesn't mean that. Excruciating. Huh? Yeah, no, it comes from a word. It comes from a word called crucifixion. Or out of the cross is literally what excruciating means. It means out of the cross. The reason why we use it for pain is because, I don't know if you realize, when they crucified you, the way they did it, but it was the most painful and most traumatic thing you could possibly go to right before you die. And the kind of pain that they felt, they didn't even have a word to describe it. They only called it the pain that comes out of the cross. Excruciating. So when I say excruciating testimony, I can tell you that the testimony, it's basically the testimony that comes out of the cross, out of the crucifixion. What did the crucifixion do to these believers, these young Jewish boys? Well, before the crucifixion, they believed in animal sacrifice. Afterwards, when they realized who Christ was because of his crucifixion, they believed in Christ's sacrifice. Before, they believed in the law of Moses. Afterwards, they believed in Christ's life. Before, they believed in strict monotheism. God was only one. After Jesus, they realized it was a trinity. Before, they believed in Sabbath, the Sabbath, and then afterwards, they started to worship on Sundays. Now, Jewish people still probably worship on Sabbath, but they also started to include Sunday mornings. They believed in a conquering Messiah, a political ruler, and afterwards they realized he was a sacrificial Messiah. And then lastly, they believed in the circumcision to be part of God's people, but afterwards they realized it was baptism and communion. All of this happened because of an impact event called the crucifixion. Once that happened, everything changed, and they realized there's a fulfillment here. That's the excruciating evidence, the evidence that comes out of the cross. Expected testimony. I'm going to fly through these really quick, but that really deals with prophecy. Not only did Jesus come and say all the right things and do all the right things, but he actually fulfilled a lot of prophecy. Like, for instance, he was born of the human race. We knew that had to happen in Genesis 3. He was in the line of David, which you read about in Jeremiah. Okay, how many of you chose which family you'd be born in? Right? You can't do that. So that was prophetic. He was born in Bethlehem. How many of you chose where you would be born? Can't do that. It's prophetic. He was both going to be God and man, as Isaiah predicted, and he was going to be able to visit the temple at a certain time, which he did. He's going to die around 30 to 33 AD. When you read the book of Daniel, it tells you the number of years or how long it's going to be. It actually lines up really, really well when Jesus was actually crucified, and he's going to be that sacrifice of Isaiah 53. He fulfills all of that, which nobody could have ever done. In fact, the odds against that are trillions upon trillions to 1. It's like if I told you that you had a winning lottery ticket and it was 1 trillion to 1, but I know this one's the one because all the numbers match up, would you take that ticket? Jesus is that ticket. 1 trillion to 1, he's the only one that was able to do that. He is the sure bet. And lastly, extra biblical testimony. I can tell you this. If you look in the Jewish Talmud, if you look at the Jewish historian Josephus, if you look at Tacitus or Pliny the Younger, both Roman historians, and you never opened up a Bible, you would get this story. Okay? No Bible. Jewish Talmud, Josephus, the historian, Roman historians, Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, you would get the story that Jesus was a Jewish teacher, that he healed and performed miracles, that he was called the Messiah, that he was rejected by the Jewish leaders, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate under the reign of Tiberius. His followers believed that he was alive again. They started to spread, that the believers had reached Rome by 64 AD. Again, that's 30 years. Again, that is really, really quick for a lot of people. Okay, for us, we can get to Rome tomorrow if we wanted to. For them, 30 years, that was really fast, and they worshipped him as God. You get all of that information without opening the Bible. So what can we conclude from all this information? First of all, it's fact. It's not fiction. If it says Jesus said it, then he really did say it. If it says Jesus did it, then he really did do it. And so what we're reading, the reason why I'm a Christian is because it points to the truth. It points to facts. What I like to say is that Christianity is a falsifiable religion. You could actually prove it's false if you show me that the universe never had a beginning, or if you show me that Jesus never rose from the dead. Problem is, we have overwhelming evidence that the universe did have a beginning and therefore needs a beginner, and that Jesus, a man named Jesus, actually lived, died, and rose again. We have very good evidence for that. So having said all that, this is why we fall on Christ and follow Christianity. The question we now have to ask is, who is this Jesus? We haven't really looked at him yet. But if that's the man we're to follow, what did he say about himself? What would he say about what we're doing as a remembrance to him, like worshiping him? What would he think about that? And what would he think about the way we're living our lives according to what he taught? And that's what we'll look at next week. But right now, like I said, I've not gone over my time. I hope it was fun. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, or comments on anything I might have said? Or any questions maybe I can clarify? Or maybe you've heard an objection. Well, my friend said this about what you just said there. Or anything like that. Is there any more I can help with? And nobody likes to ask us first questions, so I'll ask the first one. Okay? I was kind of hoping for this. Nobody asked this, because I thought about it after I left here. When I said, after all this, about how God created everything and he designed everything, what's the main objection you hear about that? And here's the hints. Maybe you've heard it before, you just don't remember. If God created everything, then who created God? Does anybody know how to answer that? You could say, well, he's always been, right? Well, yeah, you would say, well, he's always been. Well, how can you justify that? Well, let me help you. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't want to go around circles like that. I'm going to answer them, okay? We understand that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. We know that the universe began to exist. Therefore, something beyond it had to create it in order to exist, right? We don't believe that things just pop up out of nothing for no reason. I mean, we might say that, oh, it just popped up out of nowhere. No, you don't believe that, right? If there's a big, for lack of a better word, if there was a big bang in the back office, pastor would get up and go look and see what made that happen.
Right.
And what I say, don't worry, pastor, nothing made that happen. You wouldn't believe that, right? Because we know that there must be a cause for everything that begins to exist. Question: does God ever begin to exist? No. He has always been. Therefore, in order, when people say, well, who created God? He needs no creator. He has always existed, right? It has to start somewhere. And the thing is, most atheists and skeptics were perfectly fine when they believed that the universe has always existed, and therefore the universe didn't need a creator, until the science showed that that was false. So the universe needs a creator, something that is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Well, what do we do then? We take a step back and we say, okay, well, it looks like there must be a timeless, spaceless, and immaterial being that caused it all. And because he is timeless, he doesn't begin to exist. So this is where we say, well, who created God? God was not created. He has always been. And that goes against the idea that time doesn't, he had to create time. He's beyond time. So when people ask that question, he doesn't begin to exist. He always has been. And people were fine when they thought the universe was that, but somehow now you apply it to God, they don't like it. I don't know. Something gets weird about that. But anyway, anybody think of another question or thought or idea? I know I gave you a lot, and it's probably overflow. Yeah, that's it. All right, yeah. If you think about anything, again, feel free to either look me up or I get questions all the time in my emails or on my website or things like that, and so it's just a hobby for me. I pray this was a blessing to you. We've looked at, does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? Is the New Testament true? We can say yes to all of that, which points us to the direction of Christianity. Now we're going to look at Christ himself. And I pray that you come back next week. We'll be able to take a deeper look. Now I can actually open up the scriptures and show you what they actually said. We haven't been able to do that because I had to prove whether or not the scriptures were true. So now we can do that. Thank you all so much. God bless you. And thank you again, Pastor Allen.
Yes, amen. I want to thank Jean again. Certainly did a wonderful job tonight. I do hope he has challenged you to the fullest. Somebody asked like he started out, why are you Christian? Well, is Christianity true? Oh, okay.